A few weeks ago, I told you about the overabundance of kale that I have from my first homegrown garden, and if you were particularly observant, you may have noticed from that small clip that I inserted of my garden in that video that I also have an overabundance of Swiss chard. And again, like I said in that video, when it came time to choosing what to plant in my garden, the nutrition nerd totally took over and I probably planted way more leafy greens than I really needed to, which is not necessarily a bad thing because now I have a lot of leafy greens that I can feed my family. And if I have them, I might as well eat them rather than let the snails or the slugs eat them, of course. But Swiss chard, like kale and other leafy greens, are not technically the type of vegetable that most children rave about, hence the need to get creative with it. So in this week's video, I thought I'd share 3 simple recipes that include Swiss chard and that have been hits within my family, and which you can kind of see as gateway recipes to getting your children to love leafy greens. So the first recipe is a Swiss chard banana bread, and what you'll need for this recipe is about 210 grams of spelt flour, or you can also use whole wheat flour. And for the conversion to cups, check out the Veggies and More website. I'll put both measurements there. After you've measured out your flour, you can add about 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, as well as half a teaspoon of baking soda and a pinch of salt. And afterwards, give it a good mix. You can also add about a teaspoon of cinnamon here, but I've forgotten to add it here, so you'll see I'll be adding it a little bit later on in the recipe. And once you've done this, you can mix all of your wet ingredients. So you start with 1/3 to 3/4 of a cup of finely chopped dates. You can adjust this based on how sweet you want your banana bread to end up. And then you'll need to add about 1/3 of a cup of oil. And if you don't want to add oil, you can always switch this out for unsweetened applesauce. A teaspoon of vanilla, as well as about 3 large overripe bananas or 4 small ones. Finally, you can add about 1 bunch of Swiss chard, which in my case was about 6 leaves. I've taken the stems off because I find them a little bit too hard. And as you can see, my little one really wanted to help me chop. She's at that stage in life where she just wants to be doing whatever mommy's doing. So that's what she's doing there with her little kid-sized butter knife. Once that is done, give it a good blend, and if you find that the ingredients aren't mixing properly, you can add a little bit of plant milk, but only if you really need to, because you don't want to make the mixture overly liquid. While that's going, you can chop 2/3 of a cup of walnuts and add them to the dry ingredients. Give it a good mix, and if you, like me, forgot to add the cinnamon earlier on, you can do so at this point. Then mix the liquid ingredients together with the dry ingredients. Just make sure not to overmix, because if you do, your banana bread will become a little bit too dense in terms of texture. And then pour it in a mold. In my case, I'm using my cast iron loaf mold, which I've graciously received from my parents-in-law for my birthday. And then place it in the oven at 175 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 50 to 60 minutes, or until you can insert a toothpick into the banana bread in the middle and it comes out clean. Once it's done, remove from the oven and let it cool before you serve it. You can keep it covered on your counter for up to 3 days, or it keeps well in the refrigerator for up to a week. And you can of course also slice it and store it in the freezer for up to 1 month. When you want to enjoy it, simply thaw the slices in the refrigerator overnight and eat them up in the morning. Now you can serve this up whichever way you'd like. In our case, I've served it with some fresh strawberries from our garden, as well as some frozen blueberries, a few dollops of plant-based yogurt, or a glass of plant-based milk, as well as a sprinkle of ground chia seeds. This banana cake came out really delicious. You couldn't taste the bitterness of the Swiss chard in it at all, and my whole family enjoyed eating it. Now for the second recipe, I decided to make Swiss chard chips because the kale chips I made last time were such a hit with my little one, and I was just so happy to see her eat the leafy greens in this way that I was pretty sure that she would enjoy the Swiss chard chips as well. So for this recipe, I made a different dressing, and I'll link the recipe that inspired it down below. It comes from Fou de Légumes Verts, which is a book that I received a while ago from a friend. So I've adapted this recipe a little bit in terms of quantities. It's a really simple recipe. All you need to begin with is 3 tablespoons of melted coconut oil, to which you'll add 1 tablespoon of maple syrup and 2 tablespoons of raw cacao. And then I've mixed it all together before adding 2 pinches of dried chili peppers and about a pinch of salt. Then what I've done is destemmed my Swiss chard and cut it up in small little pieces with my hands. And then I rolled the pieces into a kitchen towel to help absorb the humidity. You can also use a salad spinner, but I don't have a salad spinner, so this is the best way I have to dry my leaves. You want to make sure that they're really dry because the more humid they are, the longer they will take to dry up in the oven. And once you've done that, simply throw them into your dressing and give them a good whirl, making sure that each side of the leaves are equally coated with the dressing. Then spread out your Swiss chard cacao mixture coated leaves onto a baking sheet that's lined with a baking paper, making sure that they're not touching so that they can dry properly. In my case, the amount of Swiss chard that I used originally yielded about the equivalent of 2 baking sheets, as you can see here. So depending on how much you want to make, you can adjust it going up or down in terms of the quantity of the ingredients used. And once you've laid it all out, you want to sprinkle it with about 2 tablespoons of chia seeds and 2 tablespoons of grated coconut before putting it in the oven and baking it at about 75 degrees Celsius or 170 degrees Fahrenheit for about 45 to 60 minutes or until the chips are crisp. Then let them cool and serve immediately. As was the case with the kale chips, if you have any leftovers, you can keep them at a room temperature for a couple of days, and if they do get a little bit soggy, simply pop them back into the oven for a couple of minutes until they become crispy again. Finally, the last recipe consists of a Swiss chard tahini dip. And what you'll need for this recipe is about 1 bunch or 4 to 6 leaves of Swiss chard, which you'll destem and chop up in small pieces. Then place those in a food processor, or in my case, the receptacle I use for my blender, and then add to it 2/3 of a cup of extra virgin olive oil, a half cup of tahini, 5 garlic cloves, and about 1/3 of a cup of fresh lemon juice. Now you can adjust this to taste based on how lemony or bitter you want your final mixture to be. And then simply blend all ingredients together. Now, what's really important here is for you to taste your dip once it's all blended together and adjust the flavors according to what you like. So in my case, when it came out, I found that it was a little bit too bitter for my taste. So I decided to sweeten it by adding a couple of dates. And to increase the iron content of the dip, I've also opted to add some hemp seeds to the mix. Now you can use flax seeds or chia seeds as well, but I found that with the hemp seeds being the same color about as the mix, it would yield a nicer color. And I added about 1/4 cup of 4 tablespoons. Then I gave it another whirl and gave it another taste. Found that the bitterness was gone, but that it needed a touch of salt, so I've added that at this point and gave it another mix before transferring to some nice little white serving bowls. Now this dip can be eaten with crackers, or you can also serve it to your children with some fruits or vegetables that they can dip in. And you can of course also use it as a spread on sandwiches, or even mix it with pasta to use as a sauce. It keeps well in the fridge for a couple of days. I even kept it in a cooler for the 2-day trip that it took us to get to our final destination on holiday in France. So that kept really well as well. And even my youngest really enjoyed it. Although I must say that if you want to serve it to your babies, I would suggest reducing the quantity of garlic a little bit, because without getting too much into the details, it can be a little bit irritating when it comes out the other end. But all in all, it was a really delicious recipe, and I hope that your family enjoys it as much as mine did. If you give any of these recipes a try, let me know how you found them in the comments below. And of course, as per usual, you can find all of the ingredient measurements and methods on the Veggies and More website. I'll put a link to the post down below. And I realize that leafy greens like Swiss chard are usually most likely used in soups and stews and curries and salads. But my preschooler is just starting to warm up to the texture of leafy greens, so she doesn't typically like to eat large amounts of them in this way. And on the other hand, my baby is just starting to eat solids, so eating them in this kind of texture is also a bit difficult for him at the moment, which is why I find the type of recipes that I've decided to share in this video so useful with little ones. So if you have little ones and would like to see more videos like this one, where I take a very nutrient-rich plant food and try to incorporate it into a family's diet in a way that appeals to little ones, then please give this video a like so I know to make more like it. On this channel, I share my knowledge and my experience as a registered dietitian to help families and little ones thrive on a plant-based diet. So if you'd like to see more of this content, or if you'd like this type of information to pop up in your feed more frequently, then I also encourage you to subscribe. And with that said, that's it for today. Until next time, ciao ciao!